Alrighty, in this video we are going to be talking about classes. So really, in JavaScript, if you're familiar with creating classes, and I'm finger quoting right now, you're probably familiar with dealing with the prototype and defining methods on the prototype and all that really awful weird stuff that doesn't really look all that pretty. Well, in ES 2015, we now have an actual dedicated class syntax. So this video is not about object-oriented architecture or talking about, or rather object-oriented design. This video is just about the syntax and how we can use the syntax to write our classes without resorting to creating functions that kind of act like classes with the prototypal inheritance system that JavaScript uses. In reality, the class syntax that I'm about to show you is practically just a wrapper for what you already could do. But as you're going to see, it is significantly more clean and frankly long overdue to be added to JavaScript. Now, I will say again, I am running my HTTP server on the public folder and I am running Babel in watch mode. So let's get our HTML file out of the way real fast. We're just going to do 05 classes and we're going to change this to 05 classes. And then I'm going to hop down to source scripts, new file, 05 classes.js, and I'm going to go ahead and just to avoid namespace collisions, open up a self-executing function. Then in addition to that, I'm going to split my screen, open up our classes right there to see what Babel is going to do. Okay, so let's just do one of the most simple basic classes that you're going to see in a million different examples on any language that has class support. Let's create a person. Not surprisingly, we can just say class person, and if you're familiar with C++ or C# or Java or PHP, it's going to look very, very familiar to you, which is such a nice change. Let's go ahead and hit Control S and see what happens on the right-hand side. Okay, so maybe not as pretty. But like I said, this class syntax really, even if the browser itself supported the class syntax, it would more or less do what Babel is doing right here. And Babel is really just, making the class syntax work in the way that it will if your browser had supported it. But of course, because we're using Babel, we can use this feature without having to worry about supporting or the support of older browsers. Okay, so what's one of the most important thing that you're going to do with the class? Well, that's going to be your constructor. So your constructor is responsible for doing the initialization of your object. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constructor. And it's going to take in a parameter called name. And it's simply going to do this underscore name equals name. I'm going to hit Control S. So the way you declare constructor in JavaScript classes or ES2015 classes is creating a method called constructor. Now there's a bunch of things actually to point out about the syntax before we go any further. So we're making a method and we're calling it constructor. We don't have to put a colon anywhere. We don't have to put commas anywhere. We don't have to worry about forgetting a comma. Frankly, it's a really, really nice syntax to work with. So now we can go ahead and let's just go ahead and add another method to this. I'm going to add a method called render. And render is simply going to do console.log, and then I'm going to pass in, hi, I am a person named this underscore name. And what we have here is we have just more stuff, more really, really difficult to parse code if you're not particularly familiar with JavaScript, and also because it's creating these additional helper functions here at the top of the file that it takes advantage of to reduce the size of the code. But yeah, let's go ahead and use our object, or our awesome class rather. I'm gonna say const Nelson equals new person Nelson. So here I'm going and I'm instantiating this class, and I'm passing a parameter into his constructor. And then I'm simply going to say Nelson.render. Hopping into Chrome, I can back out of this and open up my 05 classes.html, and we see the render method has indeed been invoked. So classes are a really great way to sort of organize your code, and I'm sure most of you guys have been basically using class-like structures for a while, but now we have actual classes that we can define in a really clean syntax. Let's talk about other things we can do with classes. We can add properties, just like what we can with object literal. So I can go ahead and say get name, return this underscore name, and then I can also add a setter. I can say set name name, and I can do something like console log setting name to name, and then say this underscore name equals name. So now I can come down here, and after my first render, I can say Nelson.name equals whoa, and then I could say Nelson.render. So as you see, our getters and our setters were indeed added up here. So if I come back into Chrome, I can hit reload, and I can see that my first render got invoked, I set my name to a different thing, and then my second render got invoked. Really straightforward stuff. One thing that I'm going to point out preemptively, because I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, there is no accessibility. So by that, I mean there's nothing stopping me from, instead of saying Nelson.name equals whoa, I can say Nelson._name, directly accessing that local variable. And then open up Chrome again, hit reload. Notice how we get the same render method output, but we no longer have our setter being invoked, which could be problematic if our setter does some sort of validation to make sure we're setting it to a not null name or whatever. There are ways to do accessibility with classes in ES2015. We're going to talk about that in the next video, though. Okay, so again, pretty straightforward. We can make classes. Classes can have properties. Classes can have a constructor. Classes can have methods. Classes can also have static methods. So for example, let's say I wanted to create a static method on my person class called loadPeople. So to create a static method, we simply add the static keyword. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of static, static refers to having this method added to the class itself, as opposed to the individual objects. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to write this load people, and he's going to return an array of new people. So new person, person 1, and then new person, person 2. And then I can come down here, and I'll just delete the instantiation of myself here and replace it with const p1, p2 equals person.loadPeople, and I can say p1.render and p2.render. And if I go ahead and I invoke this, you'll see you see hi, I'm person name person 1, hi, I'm person name person 2. Okay, so this static method is only accessible, it's kind of like a singleton. It doesn't have access to any individual object instance of person, and when you invoke it by accessing it through the class name, not through the object name. So for example, if I did a console log p1.loadPeople, and I came back here and I re-rendered this, notice how I get an error. p1.loadPeople is not a function. Well, again, that's because I declared it as static. So because it's static, it's not tied to an object instance, it is tied to the class name itself. And we could probably see that somewhere, like our load people. So it just passed a different, a second argument into its custom create class method, but that's fine. Okay, again, not a whole lot to talk about. This isn't video about object-oriented design. There's another feature of classes that's important to know. However, this particular feature isn't used as common as you think it might be. And I guess the reason for that is that often in JavaScript, we don't use classes very often. We don't use inheritance, rather, very often. We generally, if we're going to write a class, we write a class, and then we use dependency injection or something like that to change its behavior. But because it's there and because it can be very useful, let's talk about inheritance. So let's say I wanted to create a subclass of person. So I'm going to say class admin, and then I'm going to say extends person. So this extends keyword should be familiar with, to you if you're familiar. I just accidentally a word there. Should be familiar to you if you're familiar with languages like PHP or Java. And if you're familiar with C#, it's the equivalent to if I had put a colon there, but obviously that's not valid JavaScript. So we use the extends keyword. Okay, so when we extend, we can override methods or add new methods. We can say like do an admin thing is a new method that's only on the admin class. And I can say console log doing admin things. And so now if I go ahead and I just nuke this object instantiation, I can say admin1 equals new admin. Admin1 do an admin thing. And then come back here and refresh, and we see doing admin things. But of course, if I went ahead and say admin1.render, which is a method that's defined on its base class, we'll see something interesting. Of course, we'll say, hi, I'm a person named undefined. And of course, that's because we did not invoke the constructor of person properly. So let's replace this with admin1. Come back here and refresh. And now, hi, I'm a person named admin1. I actually went about doing it like this because I wanted to emphasize that the constructor will carry over. The constructor of the base class will carry over to the subclass, except for cases where you create your own constructor. So if I come here and create my own constructor and hit Control S, we will get an error because we're not invoking the super constructor. So once you create your own constructor, you're no longer deferring the responsibility of constructing off onto the base class. So we have our own constructor here. How do we invoke the base constructor? Well, it's really easy. We just use the super keyword. So I can say super, and I can say, I'm an admin. Come back here and hit refresh. And we say, see, hi, I'm a person named I'm an admin. Now you notice that this parameter is now ignored because the method that's being invoked when we construct this object is now this constructor, which is basically replacing the passing that parameter through to the superconstructor with a string literal. All right, the last thing I want to do is go ahead and replace the render method completely on the admin class. So all I have to do is create a render method. No special syntax required, no override, no virtual, no anything like that. We just replace the method entirely by typing in render. And I can say console log rendering an admin. And now if I come back to Chrome and refresh, it'll say rendering an admin instead of what it said before. Now, the last question would be, how would I invoke the base render method from my overridden render method? And as you might have guessed, that comes from the super keyword. So I can come in here and say super.render. And this will actually go out and invoke the base class render. So if I come here and refresh, we now see rendering an admin, which is what I have here on line 36, but then it immediately goes, hi, I'm a person named I'm an admin, because of the super.render invocation that we have on line 37. And that's about it. That's really all I wanted to talk about. The syntax is really straightforward. Again, no commas, no colons, just a straight up class that should feel right at home if you're familiar with any other object-oriented language. So I think that about wraps this video up, and we'll see you guys in the next one.